management, and technical operations. He had key roles in the development of negotiated service agreements, my personal favorite, the Forever Stamp, and the Priority Mail Flat Rate Box. Michael has his degrees from Penn State, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you to the Lexington Institute for including me among this illustrious group of speakers invited to talk about something that I think is a very important and timely issue. Yes, timely. We're probably far enough into an election year that any comprehensive postal reform is unlikely, but that doesn't mean that the underlying issues that affect our industry are going to go away anytime soon. Before I begin, I want to make two disclaimers. First, the comments I'm about to make are mine. They don't reflect the official position of Postcom or any of its members. Postcom's members are fine, decent, smart, generally good-looking people. The fact that an arrogant jerk runs their association should not reflect that. Second, I will be relying heavily on some oversimplification. In part, it's for rhetorical effect, but mostly I'm a simpleton. And postal reform is a complex issue, and I'm going to opine on it in any meaningful way. I have to sort of reframe and reduce issues to a level of complexity that I can digest. Now, with that out of the way, I want to ask for a show of hands. And I'd ask everyone in the room to raise your hand if in the last year you have paid postage, either sent a letter or mailed a package. Wow, 100%. All right, next. Now, please raise your right hand if you pay taxes. The working title of this talk was "Let's Plunder Ratepayers to Protect Taxpayers." Turns out they're the same group of people. Now, clearly I'm exaggerating something to make an obvious point, because my premise really is about a crucial tension that I think has had and will have important implications for the future of postal reform. And it's not ratepayers versus taxpayers. It's something I like to frame as pragmatists versus fundamentalists. And the notion that we must somehow avoid a taxpayer bailout of the Postal Service is a fundamentalist meme that I think has unfairly shaped postal reform efforts in recent years. So the dearly departed HR 756 and similar legislation that has resurfaced in recent years, they all have sort of the basic same structure. It includes either Medicare integration or something akin to that would shift some costs off of the Postal Service, plus a bunch of other little things that really don't do anything important at all. And so I think the reason for this is pretty clear. Sensible people seem to agree that Medicare integration resolves a basic unfairness. Postal employees pay into Medicare for their careers, and then when they retire, the Postal Service has to pay their retiree health benefits, and those employees are under no obligation to sign up for Medicare. In addition to resolving a basic unfairness, that Medicare integration would have a substantial positive benefit on the Postal Service's financials. The challenge becomes, and the sticking point has always been, budget scoring. We have to somehow pay for the Medicare hit to avoid a taxpayer bailout. It seems ironic, perhaps, that the same sort of basic constraint that created the original pre-funding problem now forces us to load up potentially positive postal reform with things like a chief innovation officer or rate increases over and above what's allowed by law today. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to make you aware of something. We are now in the 12th year of the longest peacetime economic expansion in the history of the United States, and we're at full employment. Despite these extremely favorable economic circumstances, the federal budget this year will exceed $1 trillion. Now, despite that once unthinkable state of affairs, core inflation in the U.S. is essentially zero. And beyond that, interest rates are at historic lows and rapidly approaching zero. Anyone who argues in that environment that Medicare integration would have a meaningful effect on U.S. taxpayers is engaging in a fundamentalist argument that is ultimately divorced from any pragmatic considerations. I get it. The United States is, among developed countries, extremely tax averse. So abandoning budget scoring is not realistic. I understand that. Of course, the U.S. is also the place where the worst thing you can call someone is a socialist, unless you can call them a Houston Astro. Now, Yet we are perfectly comfortable with a government monopoly that demands rents from captive business customers to subsidize consumer benefits. Technically not a tax, but absolutely government redistribution. And so let me be clear, that is a perfectly legitimate policy aim that I'm not in any way suggesting we abandon. But if we have chosen that model, then we should understand the implicit subsidies it creates and try to use the most efficient means to fund them. And I would offer that trying to pay for the universal service obligation of the Postal Service by extracting ever greater monopoly rents from highly concentrated mail-intensive industries is an inefficient and increasingly risky way to fund what we consider to be a fundamental part of the nation's infrastructure. So, if for process and timing reasons, comprehensive reform efforts are likely to run aground, what should we do? Well, I agree with a lot of the things that have already been said today. Let's look at some small steps. The USPS Fairness Act, which the House recently passed, is a nice first step, with the Postal Service still raking in $70 billion a year in revenue 14 years after PAEA. The fears that the Postal Service was somehow on the verge of collapse were clearly overstated. Repealing the pre-funding requirement makes sense. Then, let's develop a better understanding of the Postal Service's true financial challenge. Estimates of the Postal Service's retirement obligations are based on very, very pessimistic OPM actuarial assumptions. They essentially assume that all current postal employees will spend their entire careers with the Postal Service and then earn a retirement annuity. That is just not a realistic assumption. If you made more realistic assumptions, the Postal Service's underfunding problem is much less acute. And let's not stop there. As the previous speaker mentioned, the Treasury is holding $300 billion in assets paid for by postal ratepayers. And those assets are invested in securities that generate a return that is far lower than a very safe rate of return that could be earned on other assets. If you manage those assets properly, the Postal Service's financial retirement obligations could in fact flip from underfunded to overfunded. Perhaps most importantly, and this was mentioned by Tammy, and I think will come up again, we need a thoughtful examination of the Postal Service's universal service obligation. It's long overdue. Let's determine the appropriate role for the Postal Service in the 21st century and what the public needs from a government provider of postal services. That debate inevitably gets tied up in complicated issues about how you fund that, but it's a discussion that needs to happen. Now, the things I just mentioned would resolve a lot of noise that prevents a cogent assessment of the issues, but it wouldn't fix everything. I realize that. If everything I just mentioned somehow happened tomorrow, the Postal Service would still face financial losses that arise, and I want to make this very clear, not from a lack of revenue. The Postal Service revenue is growing despite falling volumes, but from an inability of the Postal Service to take costs out of its network. Yes, there are meaningful constraints. It is very difficult to close a remote post office, much too difficult from my perspective. But in reality, those rural offices, they don't cost that much to operate and maintain. The fact that there are thousands of them, yes, it's not a trivial issue, but it's not the main issue. I would say a more significant issue is the fact that the Postal Service has been unable to resize its upstream operations in the face of declining mail volumes. There are significant cost savings opportunities in middle mile activities like sortation and transportation. While there may be very sound public policy arguments for maintaining government provision of first and last mile postal operations, the private sector is, in my view, much better equipped to handle everything between. Postal productivity has stagnated in recent years and cost reduction efforts have not been adequate. Reform efforts could and should focus on removing any structural impediments or incentive issues that prevent the Postal Service from capturing greater efficiencies and concentrating on its core missions: mail delivery and access to necessary postal services. Recent reform efforts, bogged down by fundamentalist constraints and a legislative process that depends on appeasing stakeholders who are much too content with the status quo, have not even really attempted to address those underlying issues. And unless we find a way to confront those, all efforts toward reform will ultimately be for naught. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.